All right, everyone, good evening. Thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Center for Contemporary Studies. For tonight's event, Urban Transformations in Eastern Mediterranean. So my name is Killian Clark. I'm an assistant professor here in the center in the School of Foreign Service. And tonight's event is being sponsored by CCAS, Center for Contemporary Studies, and also Georgetown's Global Cities Initiative. Tonight we have two featured speakers and a fantastic discussant who are going to be talking with us about urban transformations in the Eastern Mediterranean with a focus on Istanbul, Cairo, and Lebanon. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and our discussant, and then we're going to get started. So Sarah Alcazaz is an associate professor in the politics department of School of Oriental and African Studies. The author of the very hot off the press Politics in the Crevices, Urban Design and the Making of Property Markets in Cairo and Istanbul, which will be the feature of her talk today. Her interests are very broad ranging. She works in critical political economy, urbanism, infrastructure, and digital politics. And she has a new book project that she's just getting started on the politics of digital infrastructures. We also are fortunate to have our very own American Druze Foundation postdoctoral fellow, Dima Abissab, who is here in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies this year. She received her PhD from New York University in the Middle East and Islamic Studies department with a focus on urban politics. And she's currently working on a book manuscript based on her dissertation research titled Geographies of War, Scalar Containment, Municipal Politics, and the Creation of Post-War Lebanon. And her talk will also be based on that broader project. We are also fortunate to have a fantastic discussant, Scott Wayne, who is the president of Washington, D.C.-based SW Associates LLC, which is an international development consultancy focusing on sustainable destination development for both public and private sector clients and organizations. He also has extensive experience in both Cairo and Beirut, the two of the places that we're going to be focusing on today. And so he's going to offer some remarks and comments on these two pieces of scholarship based on his experiences and expertise. So the way we're going to do this evening, we're going to have each of our speakers present for 20 minutes about their projects. Scott will then provide us with about 10 minutes of discussing comments. And then we'll let our two speakers respond, and then we'll open up to Q&A. And we will try to accomplish all of that within about 90 minutes. To those of you joining us on Zoom, welcome. We're going to be asking you to contribute to the Q&A with the Q&A feature in Zoom, and then our event manager, Coco, is going to be helping me to field those questions during the Q&A session. You can email Coco at coco.tate@georgetown.edu if you have any technical issues. I also want to make a plug for those of you who are here in person that Sarah's book is physically out in the lobby being sold. So I encourage you very much to grab a copy while you can. I tried to order it on Amazon this week, and it is not yet available on Amazon. So you can only pick up your copy here outside of the room. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. With that, please join me in welcoming our speakers, and we'll have Sarah kick us off.
Thank you, Killian, for this gracious introduction. Thank you to CCAS and the Global Cities Initiative for this incredible invitation. It's quite an honor to be here. I've been in awe of this space for a long, long time, but also very special to be here today because this is the first talk that I'm giving about the book after it comes out. So that's pretty special. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to dive right in because I know we have strict time limits. Hagia Samia and her ailing mother have lived in a Mamluk-style building in the neighborhood of Darb al-Ahmar in historic Cairo that borders a 74-acre garbage dump for decades. Throughout her life, Hagia Samia's family could see the dump's heaps of rubbish from the living room windows, its putrid smells wafting over every time wind gusted in from the east. The building had also been unmaintained for decades, and when an earthquake shook Cairo to its core in 1992, its structures started to fracture. After living with the fear of impending collapse for half a decade, the family's fortunes took a decided turn in the late 1990s. A developmental organization based in The Hague, the Aga Khan Foundation, had taken an interest in its corner of Cairo, embarking on 2 urban transformation projects in Darb al-Ahmar. Initially, in 1995, the foundation embarked on a project that would excavate the garbage dump and transform it into one of central Cairo's largest green spaces, Azhar Park, which became this. Then, in 1997, the foundation initiated a home restoration program that would eventually restore 120 buildings in Darb al-Ahmar. Hagga Samia's home was selected for the pilot phase of that program and offered a grant that would cover 90% of the costs of restoring the building from the inside out, including its structures. When I visited Hagga Samia in her restored home, and these are some of the restored homes before and after the restorations. When I visited Hagga Samia in her restored home in 2011, she took me throughout the building, showing me every intricate detail of the restorations with much pride and joy. When our discussion turned to plumbing, however, the joy on Hagga Samia's face dissipated. Working hard not to seem ungrateful, she explained that the plumbing system that the Aga Khan team had installed was more difficult to use than the original. Whereas each apartment had had its own water supply before the restorations, the engineers had installed a shared water pump in the building. Hagga Samia now had to negotiate with her neighbors about when she would be able to pump water up to her apartment, because only one apartment could use it at a time. The pumping system struck me as strange too, and I filed it away along with other oddities as intriguing designs that I would ask the engineers about. At that point, though, I assumed that there would be a straightforward technical logic to explain them. When I did ask the foundation's engineers about the odd designs, their explanations were anything but technical. They were decidedly political. Sami, an urban planner on the foundation's team, explained the shared water pumps as follows, quote, "Our purpose was that you learn to coordinate with your neighbors. So, for example, when we installed water pumps, we would find that in a building with 6 residents, each of the residents wants to install their own water pump. We would refuse such requests because if they can't resolve issues around using a water pump, then there's no sense in them restoring the house altogether. In other words, they have to talk to each other," end quote. Pumping water up building pipes wasn't the only work expected of the water pump the foundation had installed in Hagga Samia's building. Working quietly from within the invisible crevices of building walls, water pumps were expected to engineer collaborative community, as neighbors were forced to discuss sharing the water being pumped out to their floors. The Aga Khan team was designing the intricate features of restored homes to perform the work of societal engineering. I encountered that sociopolitical work again when I talked to 4 young men in a furniture workshop whose homes, some of them, had their homes restored with the Aga Khan Foundation. And one of the interesting things they told me was that the homes, when you sign up to get them restored, you have to actually contribute to the restorations. The Aga Khan pays 70% of the restorations and people pay 30%. One of the interesting things they said is that as a building, you have to divide up shares of that financial cost. And if your building, say, has one floor has 2 apartments, one takes up about 0.35 of the space and the other one takes up the rest, you would imagine it'd be a very simple calculation, 0.35 times the cost of that restoration, right? But the Aga Khan actually said it would only go up to 0.5, right? So 1.5, 0.5, so on and so forth of the shares. In other words, they didn't want very accurate shares. And that seemed really strange to me. Architects are probably really good at math. They can figure this out, right? So I asked the engineer, "Why are you doing this?" And he said, and I quote, "We didn't divide their shares very accurately, so there would be debates where residents would say, quote, 'Your apartment is a little bit bigger than mine and mine is a bit smaller,' end quote, and so on. We worked to make sure that people at the end of the day felt that they were one unit and that the unit was not their apartment. We wanted to instill in them the concept that the community is made up of interconnected units, and that it's not the apartment that's the home, rather it's a residential building, all connected, and that they have to see it as a residential unit. Then, after a while, you would start to talk to them about public spaces and that they are living around open spaces that they have to start taking care of. So you create larger and larger units and larger networks connecting the community, end quote. So Sami placed that sociopolitical work within a larger vision. And he said, and I quote, "The idea behind the project wasn't that we fixed Darb al-Ahmar. Darb al-Ahmar has more than 5,500 residential buildings. We fixed a little over 100 of those. It's a drop in the ocean. Housing rehabilitation was a tool towards something bigger. It was a step towards ensuring the existing community didn't leave," end quote. The foundation was working to reverse the displacement of Cairo's most vulnerable populations from the city's core districts, as the deregulation of property markets worked with several other forces to push them out of Cairo's core. Engineering collaborative community through the careful design of housing restorations would strengthen the bonds residents had with their neighborhood and how valuable they saw their property, producing a counterweight to the highly capitalized forces pushing them out of the center. The foundation was intervening in the workings of historic Cairo's real estate markets. As my research progressed, I realized that Sami and his team weren't the only ones turning to unorthodox methods to fight for affordable housing in the city. Through a multi-sided ethnography in Istanbul and Cairo of 6 neighborhoods undergoing urban transformation, I found a battle for housing raging in both cities. A variety of state and non-state actors were fighting to secure affordable housing on the one hand and to corner real estate markets for a luxury clientele on the other. This battle was not raging in traditional political arenas, however. Rather than agitate for familiar redistributive policies like housing subsidies or exclusive land grabs or rent controls, urban protagonists were relying on the subtle, quiet machinations of urban planning and design to redistribute and restrict access to the city's housing. In Istanbul, a group of urban activists turned to the heritage industry to secure affordable housing in Fenerbahçe along the Golden Horn by reframing private residences into globally valued heritage. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. Meanwhile, the Turkish state appropriated a grassroots environmental movement seeking protections for the city against earthquake, natural disasters, and especially earthquakes, to devalue affordable housing in the city center as prone to collapse and a hazard to the city as it worked to transfer that property to developers. Back in Cairo, a corporate developer worked to corner downtown's real estate market, not through corruption or patronage politics, as we tend to use that lens a lot in Middle East studies, but by mobilizing building aesthetics, a topography of hidden alleyways, and the Egyptianization of commercial culture to render property exclusive, secure, and valuable to a luxury clientele. Time and again, urban protagonists were deploying the careful design of the urban built environment to do the work of restricting and redistributing access to housing. In particular, careful urban design was expected to transform how property was valued in a neighborhood so as to favor particular groups over others on open real estate markets, fostering what I conceptualize as particularistic value. What does that mean? Well, markets are fundamentally circuits for the exchange of commodities, and commodities are only exchangeable if their value is calculable and recognizable on those circuits. As an incisive body of literature has already shown, the value of any given commodity is not a naturally occurring fact, simply discoverable on the open market. Competing actors dedicate considerable work to defining how the value of a potential commodity like a home gets calculated on the market. When our protagonists designed urban built environments that would engineer community, preserve heritage, decrease disaster risk, or evoke cultural movements, they were investing considerable work into shifting how particular groups came to value their neighborhood's urban fabric. Engineering a wholesale shift in how that urban fabric is valued would transform its legibility and calculability as exchangeable real estate in favor of some groups over others. In other words, they were mobilizing a carefully designed urban built environment to produce particularistic value through which they then intervene in the workings of real estate market. The battle for housing in Cairo and Istanbul was unfolding from within the rationales of market dynamics as a struggle over how the value of homes were being defined, claimed, and experienced. So this book asks what happens when the battle over protection for vulnerable populations shifts from pushing back and contesting the boundaries of the market to finding ways of operating within it. How do we come to understand and locate the workings of the political, especially when battles over the distribution of a city's resources operate from within the logics of the market? Now, critical scholars assume the absence of a political machinery of redistribution under a neoliberal order that unequivocally empowers one class over another, or is defined by what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession. So I find the insight of this scholarship that there's a neoliberal intellectual and political project that was born out of the anxieties of a global corporate capitalist class in crisis, especially as it could no longer rely on direct colonialism to buttress capitalist accumulation, quite insightful and helpful. What I disagree with this literature is that these class foundations had actually successfully permeated the inner workings of the market and seamlessly translated into neoliberal machinery that then foreclosed the space for class-based redistributive struggles and politics from within that system. So questioning that assumption, I actually find that markets are incredibly malleable and are being deployed to perform a variety of contradictory political projects. So what does that mean for the political? Well, one of the conclusions of this literature is that neoliberalism operates through depoliticizing the political. I argue instead that what we are seeing is a displacement of the political onto the contested design of the most private and intimate spaces of the city as they are deployed to manipulate markets. And there are three implications to the displacement of political struggles in this way that I want to talk about today. The big one is that this kind of displacement works to depoliticize not just class politics in the city, but also the politics around other urban struggles as well. So for urban practices like heritage preservation, engineering, community, to operate as these subtle, quiet vessels for manipulating market dynamics, they too need to be extricated from the political struggles in which they are embedded. So for example, very easy one, heritage preservation is generally understood to be something that is embedded in identity politics. But I show in chapter 3, for example, the ways in which the monumental kind of a shift away from a monumental understanding of heritage to an environmental understanding of heritage, which kind of values all historical terrain as valuable, works to extricate, doesn't necessarily succeed, but works to extricate heritage preservation from that politics. And then, so the conclusion, so the idea here is to say that this double performance of depoliticization is a kind of a crucial way in which neoliberalism works. And the political struggles that operate through in the neoliberal moment operate through being layered upon these histories of struggle around these other urban practices. But in spite of the double performance of depoliticization, political struggles don't actually disappear. They seep into the city's built environment, burdening the city's intimate, invisible, and private spaces with the weighty political projects neoliberalism was presumed to have effaced. So the second implication here is that these political burdens create innumerable contradictions in the city, like the inconvenient water pumps we saw earlier. And third, as those contradictions manifested, they often laid bare the layering political work onto the design of everyday spaces. And as urban protagonists challenged those contradictions, they repeatedly reanimated the politics. So many actors were working to obfuscate. I have enough time for this. Okay, so let me go back to my ethnography, talk a little bit to kind of illustrate this repoliticization. Zeynep and her husband Hikmet live in Fener, Istanbul, in a home built by a Greek family at the turn of the 20th century. They applied for a housing restoration grant from the EU as part of the EU's rehabilitation program in the neighborhoods of Fener and Balat. After much negotiation with the EU's team, they decided to only agree that the EU restore the exteriors of their home and forego pretty much free money to restore the interiors of their home. And I asked them why. And they mentioned several disagreements with the EU team. Central to those disagreements were disagreements around their bathroom. Originally, the home was built with only one bathroom on the top floor where the master bedroom is located. When they moved in, Zeynep and Hikmet constructed a second bathroom on the second floor where the living and guest rooms are located. They built the bathroom into the stairwell that was used as closet space by the previous owners. The EU team saw that the bathroom was not part of the original plan for the house during its preliminary survey and said that the bathroom would have to be removed as part of the restorations. Hikmet explained that he saw the EU's demand unreasonable since, quote, if we have visitors, they stay on the second floor and it gets pretty crowded. Past owners may not have had the same need for a bathroom. I mean, in a way, this setup meets our Islamic values, end quote. For Hikmet, having a bathroom that was accessible to guests was especially crucial for a family and their guests who made ablutions ahead of prayer 5 times a day, a concern that he was not sure their Greek Christian predecessors shared, nor the EU experts knocking on their door today would necessarily appreciate. As he brought up the cultural and religious differences that set his family apart from the Greek predecessors to defend the sterile bathroom, Hikmet reinvested the project with the identity politics that the EU and UNESCO had worked so hard to extricate themselves from. Interestingly, and I talk a lot about this identity politics in chapter 3. Interestingly, Hikmet framed his critique of that politics not in terms of a traditional concern over the elevation of one identity group over another, but in terms of the very technical architectural design questions that the EU had themselves deployed to distract away from the identity politics. Like Hikmet, so many of the protagonists I encountered repoliticized the class, racial, and religious projects that were being displaced and obfuscated through the machinations of the market, not through direct political context, but through these technical contestations of the design of electrical wiring, balconies, rooftops, and title deeds. While tracing these subtle micro practices of repoliticization recaptures the political, locates it in the intimate, the private, and the invisible crevices of the city, it also unmasks the dangers of such displacement to political life. When political struggles are obscured as they become insidiously channeled into market rationales, the overt political spaces through which these struggles were once negotiated close up. Having nowhere to go, the politics doesn't disappear. Instead, it manifests and festers within intimate spaces and sites that are much more difficult to negotiate and recuperate as a polity. The displacement of the political onto the city's intimate and private crevices under a neoliberal order leaves us with a political climate that fosters suspicion and a fracturing polity. Now, to develop this argument and kind of work through it, the book is organized in 2 parts, and I'm very happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. But very largely, the first part is a longue durée view of the making of value, especially of property, its contestation, and how class is mazed through spatial and material experiences of the city. I'm especially interested in the layered political projects through which urban decay, crisis, disaster, and so on are mobilized to manipulate value in the city. The chapters trace things like transforming water ecologies, geopolitical strategizing during the 2 world wars, the politics of literary movements, institutional legacies of rent control, disaster management, circuits through which industry travels in the city, struggles over morality in the city, and the politicization of pollution by INGOs, among other political projects that shape how value is lived and contested in both Istanbul and Cairo. Part 2 then is organized in 3 chapters, each of which is around one theme of community, heritage, and then the making of visible aesthetics of the city to look at these themes as spaces through which markets are manipulated in the production of what I call redistributive markets. I have a really, a bit from part 1 that I wanted to share with you, but I'm going to keep that for Q&A because of time, but do ask me about it. And the book ends with some reflections on kind of larger takeaways, especially about kind of how this notion of a festering polity translates into ideas of a mediated citizenship and the relationship in neoliberalism and populism. That's some reflections that I have after I finish the book. All right, thank you all so much for listening.
Hello, everyone. Sarah, that was amazing. I have like pages of notes and questions for you. Yeah, thank you, Killian, for organizing this, and thank you all for being here and for everyone who's joining us virtually. I'm really excited to share some of my work with you, and to be in conversation with Sarah also and Scott. And so today I'm going to address the question of sort of urban transformations by looking at the infrastructural arrangements and the urban policies and practices that are enacted in Lebanon, specifically by looking at waste management infrastructure. And I use waste management infrastructure to sort of anchor my discussion on how we can conceptualize the infrastructural blackouts that we are seeing materialize in Lebanon today. And I think that, you know, when we think about urban transformations in the MENA region, Lebanon's infrastructural failures and blackouts come up as a sort of failure in urban policy or a failure in urban planning, which then attributes various crises that we've seen from the garbage crisis in 2015 to the perpetual sort of electrical crisis that has been plaguing Lebanon since, you know, in the aftermath of the civil war. It reduces them to questions of, you know, funding, infrastructural sort of sustainability, capacity, these sorts of things, right? And for me, when I began my fieldwork in Mount Lebanon in 2016, I went looking to ask questions on what electrical or waste or water infrastructures were missing. I think I understood the rationing of electricity from 12 to 21 hours a day to be a cycle that resulted from the inability of the infrastructure to withstand running electricity for 24 hours, or that the garbage crisis materialized because there just wasn't any more space to dump trash, or, you know, I don't know. And so I happened to be conducting fieldwork at a very interesting juncture. And it was in the sort of aftermath or the tail end of the garbage crisis of 2015, where we saw the YouStink uprising, which emerged because of, you know, mountains of trash piling on the streets for months on end in the summer heat, rotting. Just, yeah. And so it's at the tail end of the YouStink movement, and at a point where the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Interior and municipalities are rapidly trying to come up with solutions and to make decisions on how to deal with the waste management to quell the uprisings and to also manage the sort of relentless overflow of trash that's burying the country, right? And so I began my research in a small village of Mount Lebanon called Aitit. It's it's pretty homogeneously Druze. It has about 2,000 residents. And I conducted fieldwork and interviews in the municipality there, where they were in the process of meeting and deciding on whether they wanted to construct an independent waste management facility. And this is right. So this was after the government contract with Suclean had come to an end in 2015, which basically ushered in the garbage crisis, particularly because there weren't any sort of comprehensive plans established to manage garbage disposal, which paralyzed Lebanese politics and the country as a whole, right? And so there were several proposals and solutions that were brought forth by the ministries in the country. And of course, many of them were unsustainable, and they offered only temporary relief from the crisis. Initially, the trash was moved from the streets of Beirut and the more affluent neighborhoods of Mount Lebanon to peripheral regions. They were dumped in riverbanks across the country, along the mountain ranges. And this sort of relieved some of the pressure that the government was facing from the YouStink movement in Beirut specifically. And so within that time frame, the Minister of Environment, Tariq Al-Khatib, amends the circular in November of 2015. I think that's wrong. I think it was January of 2016. Anyway, and basically they're encouraging the public and private sector to sort of activate waste sorting at the source, right? So they want to decentralize waste management. And you know, in the aftermath of that, there were more circulars that were released that were offering financial support and material support for municipalities to collect trash and sort trash on a local level. And this support was to come from NGOs that donated trucks and bins, and the other part of it, the financial support would come from the Independent Municipal Fund, which is a financial body where municipalities receive their allocated annual budgets every year. And so ITET's municipal council met and they voted unanimously in favor of constructing an independent waste management facility. And the president of the municipality at that time, Salah Al-Timani, sort of described a few reasons for why he thought everyone was, you know, enthusiastic and excited to sort of to build this independent waste management facility. And he mentioned that, you know, if managed on a local scale, there was a potential to finally have some financial transparency, which was something that municipalities had never had. And even though the construction and the production of a waste management facility was set to cost the municipality close to $1 million, having a locally managed facility will ultimately be cheaper for them in the long run because, again, since the end of the Lebanese Civil War, the contract with Suklin, the company that was in charge with managing waste, which had direct ties to the Prime Minister, Rafiq Al-Hariri, every year they would see their municipal budget short tens of thousands of dollars because of the Suklin operation. And then on top of that, they would end up with debt because of municipalities would end up in debt for money that they still owed Suklin after the money had already been taken from their budget. In any case, there was hope that managing waste on a local scale would then relieve some of the budgetary constraints. And so by 2017, the municipality opens this new waste management facility, and it operated rather seamlessly. They had received 3 trucks to pick up trash around the village. Bins were distributed. There was a sorting facility that was opened on a piece of municipal land. A conveyor belt was installed from which trash would be sorted and separated, and you know, recycled goods would be put to the side to sell, or composted goods would be put to the side to be composted or burnt. And yet, despite the success of the waste management facility, so part of the initial success of the waste management facility was because they were able to operate at a lower price because the municipality was hiring Syrian refugees and laborers who were, of course, underpaid and exploited. And they were the ones that were sort of picking up the trash, transporting it, and sorting it amongst other sort of processes involved in managing waste. And yet, despite the sort of this success, by the end of 2018, there were a lot of hardships that the waste management site was facing. The municipality still had not received its budget for 2017 and 2018. They had received funding to construct this site, but their annual budget had not been delivered. And so it's at this point that the municipal council then decides to fire all of the Syrian refugees and bring in Bangladeshi migrant workers who, you know, according to the municipality, would and could be paid significantly less. And this is because of their compromised position and the compromised position of migrant workers at large in Lebanon, where, you know, they lack any rights, any bargaining power because of the kafala system, which I could talk more about later. But it leaves the most marginalized and precarious, you know, of workers exposed to this sort of exploitation, right? And despite the council's attempts to cut these costs by you know, exploiting migrant workers even further, the IMF had sort of indefinitely postponed the distribution of the municipal budget. which led to the closure of the $1 million waste management facility that had only been operating for 1 year. So as the gates of the facility closed, and the Bangladeshi migrant workers who had worked for about 4 months went unpaid for those 4 months and remained unpaid until today. To sort of add insult to injury, in October of 2018, we find out through the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies that the IMF, the Independent Municipal Fund, not the big one, had accrued $2 billion of deficit as a direct result of the Ministry of Interior and Municipalities' policy to redistribute waste management at the local level, right? So the IMF had used all of the funds allocated from the municipal budget to finance the construction of these facilities without any long-term plan on how to either make up the funds to finance municipalities or any long-term plans on how they would fund the continued operation of these waste plants. And then on top of this, the central government arbitrarily decided to consider the funds that were given to local municipalities to construct these waste management facilities as loans. So all of the municipalities that had received the $1 million to build their waste management facilities now had not been paid for 2017, 2018 budget and had a $1 million debt on top of that. And so in this sense, the inability of the central government and the IMF, when I say IMF, I'm always referring to the Independent Municipal Fund, to provide consistent access to the funds necessary to sustain these daily operations, continuously perpetuates these various crises that we see emerging throughout the country. And so I was watching all of this unfold sort of, as I was conducting research, and I saw, how waste management ultimately became the financial responsibility of the sectarian militias / political groups, right? So in many Mount Lebanon villages, the Druze Progressive Socialist Party or the Talal Arslan's Lebanese Democratic Party step in to remedy the failure of the state yet again. And the sort of ironic thing here and the cyclical pattern that materializes is that despite the fact that the central and local government are managed by individuals from these very parties that step in to ameliorate the failure, we ultimately see these, sort of key arguments that are reproduced, and what they do is they uphold this divisive discourse that attributes blame to everything and everyone but one's own political leadership, right? And so on a local level, for example, Timeni blamed the previous municipal administration for misspending funds, and the previous administration accused Timeni of being too ambitious and idealistic. And both the current and the previous administrations agreed to condemn the Syrian refugees for issues that had nothing to do with the waste management facility. And of course, this regenerates this sort of xenophobic rhetoric. And we see that so much in Lebanon today during the economic collapse. But in all of this, what becomes apparent is that the solutions enacted to alleviate infrastructural crises constantly generate worse political, social, and economic conditions. And this is something that can be seen when looking at sort of any service industry or infrastructure in Lebanon. And so in my work, I think of this as the governmentality of inefficiency, which I argue is a particular consequence of the Lebanese Civil War of 1975 to 1990. And so to understand the current blackout and collapse of all services, infrastructure services in Lebanon, I try to sort of understand how this governmentality of inefficiency came about. And I think in that sense, it's important to briefly highlight some of the legislations that were passed during the Lebanese Civil War, because they will show us how we are where we are today. And of course, as we can imagine, the vicious cycles of violence that were occurring with the onset of the Lebanese Civil War created a power vacuum throughout Lebanon that saw the collapse of state services, the collapse of the central security apparatus of sovereignty, and the central government at this point decides in the early years, this is before we knew that it was going to be a 15-year civil war, right? So they thought 1976, there was a little break, okay, it's over. And so they decide to remedy the sort of loss of sovereignty and territoriality by enacting various decrees that were aimed at ameliorating this loss. And so in January of 1977, we see the formation of the Council for Development and Reconstruction. And this council for the CDR received millions of dollars in donations and grants from international funders and governments. But the CDR remained inoperable from its establishment well into the post-war period. And so with the efficiency of the CDR already plaguing attempts at reconstruction, this same parliamentary body met 6 months later and legislated another decree called the Municipal Act of 1977. And so this act ultimately gives municipalities jurisdiction over all matters of public service and governance. This act shifts the site of governance from the central government to the local government, right? And so by June of 1977, the central government passes 2 legislations that are tasking 2 distinct bodies with jurisdiction over infrastructural construction, with the CDR receiving all of the funds related to reconstruction and the municipality still not getting any money. So this is where the Independent Municipal Fund comes in and was formed. And it was supposed to allocate funds to the municipality. And interestingly, what we learned recently is that the CDR actually raids the IMF, or used to raid the IMF frequently and take money from the IMF for services. It's just, yeah, there's a whole story there. But, you know, as we can imagine, the legislative initiatives did little to thwart militia groups from increasing their grip on their claimed territory. And, you know, it was, on the contrary, the territorial authority of militias expanded exponentially during this time. In Mount Lebanon, we saw the recently religiously homogenized Druze Progressive Socialist Party form a civil administration of the mountain, which became the central mechanism of provisioning services and infrastructure, administrative, bureaucratic services. Everything came to function under this PSP-ran civil administration. And people of Mount Lebanon ended up depending on the civil administration over the inoperable and ineffective government agencies, right? And so these developments brought local state agencies under the control of the civil administration, and the PSP militia, who derived their budget from war tax. So this is, you know, money that they collect at tolls, at checkpoints, you know, and they use this money to then service their constituents. And the funds that are collected are used only to support their constituents, right? Doesn't matter if you're Druze and you're, you know, a supporter of the Law of Islam, you're not getting a penny. It's just, you know, it's just Shamblat supporters. You know, and this is something that happened across the country. The strategies of the civil administration weren't unique to the PSP or to Aitet or to Mount Lebanon. Across Lebanon, we were seeing militia groups developing these sort of clientelist relationships with their constituents. And, you know, on the CDR, it's important to quickly note that there was a Ministry of General Planning in Lebanon in 1975, 1976, and it was abolished to give the Office of the Prime Minister full reign over the implementation of development, reconstruction, and urban planning. So the Ministry of General Planning was, yeah. And actually, it was also the minister who then got another job as the president of the CDR. Anyway, so we sort of, you know, see the effects of this pretty quickly, right? So as soon as the civil war is over, we see Rafiq al-Hariri elected as the Lebanese prime minister in 1992. And we see decisions made to subcontract waste management to Sutlin. Again, this is a company that is owned by Rafiq al-Hariri's business partner in Saudi Arabia. And so we sort of see the extent of the corruption and the exploitation of these private contracts, or we get a glimpse of it. And one thing that Ziad Abu Rish has this article on called The Garbage Politics in Lebanon. And, you know, he sort of highlights how extensive the corruption was. And he compared the cost of a ton of dumping in Lebanon and globally. And in Lebanon, the price per ton of dumping was $45 per ton, and the global average is $10. So there's just like astronomical hikes in prices, right? And so ultimately what I'm trying to highlight and argue is that these legislations ended up serving as the sort of blueprint for militia hegemony. And they were codified in the landscape of the post-war period because a lot of the militia authority and financial capital came from the provisioning of services, and they came from the monopoly over providing for their constituents. And so their existence ultimately, the militia existence ultimately relied on the collapse of the state. And so it immediately becomes apparent that within these, legislations, for example, the IMF, in the IMF and the ACT and the CBR, there are a lot of overlapping institutions and different financing mechanisms that really prohibit any streamlined urban policy or planning from materializing. And I think the most sort of blatant roadblock to efficient governance is seen within the criteria established for the IMF. And so the distribution of funds for municipalities is based on a 1932 census that was conducted under the French mandate, which is outdated, it's falsified, doesn't account for any movement internally or out of the country. And this sort of then determines who gets what funds. So the majority of municipalities are underfunded or overfunded. And so to wrap up and to quickly circle back to the garbage crisis in 2015, I think that my argument is that these ineffective modalities of governance are intentional. If there were an operative central state providing resources or services and infrastructures to the population, what role would the militias have then, these sect-based militias have in broader political society? So it's these instrumental effects of the ACT and the CDR that enable the production of what James Ferguson calls the anti-politics machine, where the limitations of municipalities in governing effectively and efficiently are understood to be the result of the weakness of the state, and not of the governmentality of sectarianism that actually requires centralized weakness to be able to operate. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dima. Would you like to give your remarks up here, Scott? Sure, pretty great.
Thank you to both of you. Wow. A lot of food for thought, and for my world of consulting in international development, having worked in Egypt and Lebanon, and Beirut, and Cairo, a lot of food for thought in terms of solutions for some of the issues and some of the problems that I've encountered. And I find some points of contention or some controversy that I would like to raise with both of you briefly, and then put some questions out for the group. To start with, let me just recap a few of the main some of the main points that I picked up from your discussions. So with Sarah, some of what I hold on one second, lost my notes here. But first, a question for both of you. Both have focused on fractured politics in both places, and especially at the local level, impacting urban development efforts. And it's sort of, you're both sort of immersed in what the old saying, riddles wrapped in mysteries inside enigmas. And I really, first of all, I'm curious what drove you to take on these challenges, and what do you hope to see in terms of results ultimately from your work? In my world of international development, we're confronted with problems of urban planning, urban development, destination development, and especially with the USAID, the World Bank, we have very specific KPIs that we have to reach. for results, very results oriented. So as I'm listening to both of you, I'm thinking, okay, how could this help in our world, in this development world? What can I take away from this? Aside from it, it helped me to understand the complications, the complexities in Beirut and in Cairo. We're working in Darb al-Ahmar, Lebanon. I worked on the Lebanon Mountain Trail, which connected communities from the border with Israel all the way to the north, over 300 miles of communities. So a lot of issues, but we're always trying to seek some results. How do we bring communities together? How do we get past this communication issue that you, Sarah, experienced in Cairo? So I'll first throw that out to both of you as a question, and then I've got a few more questions. Start with Dima.
Sure. In terms of what drove me to take on this challenging work, I mean, I think I've always been so curious of how Lebanon would be so, things aren't going well, right? And yet the governmentality of sectarianism is never brought into question. Even, we have periods where it is in some uprisings in the Youth Think movement in October 2019, but the governmentality of sectarianism maintains it's just durable. It withstands so much. And this is something that, I'm Lebanese from Mount Lebanon, and this is something that I'm often sort of trying to think about on my own, in terms of my family and what kind of, how we go along with things, I guess. And I guess in terms of the second question of how we could help in the development world, I feel I think, and this is obviously not the problem of anyone that works in development or but I think that a lot of the conditions that are put on receiving aid for development require depoliticization and require a disconnect from the sort of root cause of the problem. And I think that, aid and development more broadly, foreign aid and foreign development, makes that stands in the way of sort of progress. So yeah.
So I think turning to Sarah, I detected some skepticism about some of the aid efforts, especially from Aga Khan Foundation, how they were essentially, it sounds like, coming with a political agenda. Social engineering is the term that you used, and what have been some ways around that, some success stories, or is it was sort of a negative picture that you painted? So
Sure. Now we can have a more good discussion. There, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. Great questions. Difficult ones. Let me just jump right into this question of, critique of what the Aga Khan Foundation were doing. Actually, so a lot of the literature I'm engaging with is a literature that Dima just engaged with as well, right? The anti-politics machine, James Ferguson's work, and so on and so forth, which for a long time has seen the development industry as quite producing, embroiled in politics, but not confronting the politics, I think. And I think that has been a very kind of salient critique in this scholarship. And actually, one of the things I wanted to do, I wanted to do two things in response to this literature, which honestly was quite formative for me as I came up with my project. With one, to say, absolutely, there is always a politics that these projects are confronting. But part of what I was doing was to say, let's think even more dynamically about the systemic forces in which they're operating. And I think that's very important for us to understand if we're going to be kind of conscious about what kind of politics any of these projects are embroiled in, right? But the other thing I also wanted to do was open up space for thinking about what reflexive, or what I call self-reflexive experts within those worlds can be producing, right? And so, in other words, I actually, when I talk about, so this is where the question of what does success actually mean, right? So sure, I have a lot of critiques of what the Aga Khan Foundation ends up doing, but there's also a part of this project that is saying, listen, a lot of the time we don't take seriously the fact that a lot of the people on the ground are working towards pretty radical progressive political projects, like someone like Sami, who's in this book, right? Who thinks of himself as quite a self-reflexive expert in the sense that he's been trained in a lot of the critical scholarship that we've been trained in, is pretty cognizant of the politics that is involved in what he does, and yet he sticks to it, right? And so it's a question of how do they navigate that politics? What are they producing? So I want to kind of open up a space for dealing with that tension, because my critique is really not just the development industry, but the larger systemic force of like the transformation towards neoliberalism. And how do we grapple with that as well as kind of an activist politics potentially?
And there's one other key point that you both have grappled with is the role of the private sector. And public-private partnerships, privatization, are both issues that you brought up. The privatization, or the corruption of privatization, public-private partnerships. You cast it also in a questionable light, so does that you don't seem to be in favor of those, which is interesting because I know in the development world they're pushing public-private partnerships constantly, also pushing investment, foreign investment, domestic investment, which you seem to refer to, at least for downtown Cairo, as luxury or commercial, corporate, use the term corporate investment, and which is interesting for us. Is this a negative for you? Do you see a positive side to this? And also, on the privatization of Lebanon, it definitely seems to be a challenge from the corruption side. So I'll put that out there, and also open the floor for additional questions.
Why don't I suggest, actually, why don't you guys keep this most recent set of questions, take one or two from the audience, and then you guys can sort of gather and into those as a group. So let's open it up to questions from you all. Please.
Thank you so much for your insights and the work you've been doing. My name's Sandra Bear. I run a company called Personal Cities, and I also work with Smart Cities World, which is based in London. So we do work looking at cities all over the world. I have two questions, but I'll just start with one in case others have questions. Regarding waste management, it is a ruse all over the world. It is not working. And these, the more bins, the more waste, the more money in the pockets of whatever sector that's handling it. What you described, you seem so diplomatic about it. I'm not speaking as you are, but it's complete and clear corruption, and it hurts, the most disadvantaged people, the migrants, the Syrians, whoever's coming into work on those projects is just horrible. So my question is, especially in the context of Georgetown University and the young people that are doing research and that understand tech, I work with companies right now that are coming up with complete new technology solutions to waste. Get rid of the bins. The bins are like gone. They're using different tech. I won't go into it, and I'm not an expert on it, but I see it all over the world. So I wonder what's happening with that? Who's working on that? This is, waste and recycling is, well, it used to be one of the top issues until these wars were started waging. But I guess, what's happening in your view that can fix some of this? And maybe, even in cities that have, older, more traditional ways, more difficult politics, whatever it is, I appreciate that. And I've spent time over there, so it's not like I'm completely ignorant, but I'm pretty ignorant. And I wonder what could go on that would sort of transform it, would, look at the digital transformation that's going on in the world and adopt it to waste and recycling. It's a long question, sorry.
No, that's great. Should we take one more? Go ahead.
Well, two amazing talks. Thank you so much. And it's so nice to see them in conversation. I'm so excited that this book is out in the world. So one common theme in both of your research is this sort of marketization, but also, Sarah, you called it like displacement of politics. And I was wondering if sort of in both stories, there's a process of obfuscating who's responsible, right? Like, and in terms of a politics of contention point of view, like how contention emerges. So in one case, it's like politics is confined into the intimate spaces, this technical details, and in another case, in the other one, it's more about like the real, as Dima, you said, the people who are actually responsible, these corrupt politicians or community leaders, are not held accountable because there's all this process of obfuscation. And I wonder if you see, going back to success stories, maybe in that light, if you see any exceptions, like if you've encountered any exceptions where people were able to sort of overcome this sort of diffusion of contention, right? And meaningfully challenge the actors who are actually responsible. Especially in Turkey, I'm wondering, like, what is the municipality doing in this story, for instance?
You both a chance to respond. Some meaty questions.
Let's start by answering your question, or thinking alongside you. I don't have any answers, but I mean, I think part of the problem is that every time there's a crisis, that leads to increased privatization, right? So whether that's through, and it materializes through all sorts of ways, but like more recently, we've seen the tech companies sort of come in and take control over things that should be public, dealt with publicly, like from the state, right? And I think that part of, and we can't, in Lebanon, the state is not providing any services, right? What is private, I mean, it's a weird overlap between public and private also, because our representatives own these private companies. So then you have that gets very, complicated. And I think part of what's important to think about, I guess, is sort of how we can opt out of, I mean, I don't live there, but like how we can opt out of dominant forms of sort of, access to resources. And there's a lot of, there are groups that work on, there's one specific one that I was involved with, Minin Municipalism, and, they sort of talk about how we can produce little communities that work outside of tech companies, that work outside of the state, that work outside of everything, but to sort of have a locally implemented solution to issues of electricity, waste, and all of these things. And so, for example, and this kind of answers your question too, or touches on it. There are villages that have installed their own solar panels and now are operating electricity on their own. Or, for example, before the solar panels, they had their own diesel generator that that didn't work with the state. But so another thing I wanted to say about
success stories?
I'll come back to it. I can't remember.
Great questions. Is there a positive aspect to private-public partnerships? I mean, so a lot of people actually, it's interesting, like when I was publishing my first piece, that was based on some of this research, I had quite a bit of so a lot of it is in chapter 4. And I had a lot of the work from the consortium that was working on downtown Cairo, basically. And one of the peer reviewers was like, wow, this sounds a lot more enlightened than any other, private developers we know. Why are you taking such a hard stance on them? And I was like, well, it's the point of the book wasn't so much to say that this is or is not working according to a particular set of metrics, but instead to trace the political projects that work through each of those. So yes, a lot of what downtown, like what Ismailia Consortium was doing in downtown Cairo, does have kind of reverberations throughout the city that are probably quite positive. But what I was interested in was tracing, what are they doing in terms of capitalist accumulation, in terms of how we think about redistribution, because that's what I'm interested in, right? Inequality redistribution. And they have a particular project vis-a-vis redistribution. They're interested in redistributing wealth upwards, basically. They're interested in giving particular echelons of society access to neighborhoods that they saw as being kind of taken away from that class, right? And bringing them back to those neighborhoods, and through that generate quite a bit of revenue for themselves. And so I'm interested in kind of, okay, so that through, how does that political project operate is what so it's a how question as opposed to yes or no, right? But is it just like, is my book just out there to say, what all these projects are doing is terrible? No, actually, I'm much more interested in what is the systemic world in which they're operating. And so that, like, how are their political projects manifesting in different ways? So there's definitely a lot that Ismailia Consortium is doing, Aga Khan is doing, the EU is doing, that is going to leave quite a bit of quote unquote positive impacts in the city. But that was less the focus of the book. For Guste, have I seen kind of, there is a hopeful message to the book as well, not completely like dystopian, because a lot of the critical scholarship really sees an end to kind of a foreclosure to a particular class politics that I see still pretty vibrant, right? I just think, it's a lot quieter than we would like it to be. And so what I've seen is people who have been savvy enough to still harness that energy, but do push the boundaries of the market, right? Are cognizant of the fact that what is at the heart of the problem is not so much that there is just this capitalist class that has taken over and completely destroyed the city, and kind of find that a very simplistic view of what's happening in the cities, right? I think that when I say a battle is raging, I mean it, right? There are people who are fighting for people that we consider kind of getting dispossessed in the city and so on, over and over again. But most of the time it's obfuscated, as you're saying. But there are examples of people who have done a really good job of making that politics visible, and especially in Istanbul. So for example, one of the groups that I had the honor to foreshadow, or to what's the right word? To shadow for a while, yeah. Was working on basically getting, so a lot of the attack on informal housing, for example, in Turkey is happening through the state buying out. So a lot of people will have some form of contract or deed or something, but it comes through kind of shadowy vessels. And so the state comes in and contests these contracts for some people, and then buys out kind of big owners in the same spaces. And so basically the smart thing that these people were doing was to get people to understand that what it's at the heart of the problem here is how we're operating with property. And so they completely, they just, the project was to convince people that private property ownership is not the answer, that collective property ownership is the answer. And so these massive legal teams and projects and urban, surveyors and so on, progressive politics would go to these neighborhoods. And I think they got up to like 120 little kind of neighborhoods to come together in Derbent, which is this huge area that you probably know pretty well, and to sign on to not negotiating with the state as individual property owners, but as collectives. And it was actually quite strong. I mean, I can't tell you what happened today, but they did do a pretty good job of getting people to understand that the crux of the problem is the violence of property rights in particular ways, right? And it's people who are getting at the heart of these issues that are doing really well. Okay, making that
This was a local legal.
local legal/urban planners. So there were a lot of lawyers, a lot of urban planners working together.
Thank you so much for two really engaging presentations. This kind of builds on things you've been talking about already, but I'm wondering, for Sarah, like if you see kind of like Sammy and Aga Khan as part of this progressive politics that you were talking about. And I'm really intrigued by the kind of very explicit social engineering that goes into planning, which, I'm not an urban planner, but I've read a little bit about, it's amazing what urban planners assume they can do socially, right? But just like building things in particular on this. And so just reading some of that as an outsider, it's interesting to see, what the best laid plans look like. So I'm curious kind of what the effects of this, like the water pump example was just such a vivid example of this. What actually, and also, I couldn't help, the assumption that people have not been cooperating in these communities forever, right? People with, but let's put that aside for a second, right? So what actually happens, and do people kind of understand that that's the goal of Aga Khan? Is it explicitly said to them, right? And do they get the point that like, oh, they don't think we can cooperate, that's why they're doing this to us? So I'm curious kind of what your interlocutors think about that. And I guess for Dima, I was wondering, like you mentioned, like there are these moments, right, when we have this kind of cross-sectarian organizing around issues like garbage, like you used. And I'm just wondering kind of like what gets sustained from those movements that kind of emerge in a crisis. Like, are there projects that we see? Because like you talked about projects that are village-based and sectarian sect-based, right? And I'm just curious if there are, whether in waste management or other kinds of infrastructure, if there are other kinds of projects that are trying to sustain, that are trying to create kind of alternative politics, right, around provision of, which is hard to imagine if geography is separating people, right? But it's kind of related to that question. I don't know if that was clear at all, but yeah.
Chantal, and then Dima has a question for Sarah, and then why don't we do Jackson also, and we'll have sort of a big pile.
Thank you so much, Sarah. These are fascinating projects, and I really enjoyed both of your presentations. My question, I think, is mainly for Dima, but a little bit for Sarah as well. So it has to do kind of with this idea of decentralization and that being kind of operational as almost like a theory of politics and governance, right? So like something that has been like imposed, recommended, so widespread all over the globe by, World Bank and the other IMF and so on. And all kind of animated by this idea that like scale itself has this kind of like causative push, right? Like the small administrative unit is supposedly having all these advantages in terms of consensus, in terms of efficiency and democracy and so on and so forth. And I'm curious about like, what is the status of this idea, I guess, in the sites in which you are working, right? Do people think this? Do they think that, the scale at which these like processes of consensus and debate are happening in and of itself matters? Have they like considered it and sort of decided that it's like not correct? I mean, like, is it sort of inherently debated, right? What the right scale of this conversation is? And I think for Sarah as well, I think it was a little bit less explicit in your talk, but I'm wondering like how thoughts about like the scale of the unit, right? And what that means for the process.
I'm gonna use my chair's prerogative to voice a two-finger on this, because I had a very similar question for you, Dima, because I'm just thinking in sort of the post-2011, post-Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt, there was so much talk of decentralization because there was so much of a sort of effort to pull power away from these highly centralized states that had been micromanaging it. I mean, we just had a local and urban politics section in my comparative politics class this week, and we read this piece about how these Belediye municipality governments essentially for decades had no power to do anything. And so there was these big pushes among activists to basically, claw some power and decision-making responsibility away from these central governments and bring it closer to the people. But then I hear your talk and sort of building a much on top. I mean, this can go so badly if it's done poorly. I mean, but I'd like to hear you sort of weigh in on that as sort of decentralization in good or bad forms. Sorry, that was me jumping the queue. Let's have Jackson's questions, and then Dima, you have a question for Sarah.
Great. So thank you both. I just wanted to hop on to Fida's question about the water pumps example. Just a few sort of basically how common was that? And was there any rhetoric around climate security? Because it's an enforced water insecurity that's trying to force cooperation. And so much of the literature that I've read on Cairo and water insecurity is about praising bottom-up efforts at ameliorating water insecurity. So it's interesting to see a foundation coming in and imposing that to enforce cooperation. And then I guess related to that is so much of what I read about Cairo today is about destruction of historical of the built environment, right? And I just wonder how you see your work and your interlocutors in relation to that broader story. Thank you.
Dima.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted you to talk a little bit more about, you said I can't remember what exactly, but somebody being employed to perform contradictory projects. At some point, and it's a quote.
We have recorded. So we have.
Was that Mike? No.
No. I mean, I have something about contradictory political projects.
Yeah, so if you could just say a little bit about that. There's no specific question, but you kind of.
I have to let each of you answer that even thicker stack of questions here for the
Sarah, you had said that the market is deployed for contradictory projects. So that's the quote.
Yes, yes.
More or less.
Yes, I now know what Dima's talking
Do you want
about.
to go first this time, Sarah?
Sure, let's do it. There's a lot here. All right, let's go to this question of societal engineering. Thank you, Fida and Jackson, for that. So 100%, there's a ton of contradictions, right? So a couple of things I wanted to kind of foreground is that in the kind of urban studies literature, there's historically a very large focus on how state driven projects and their planners were very gung-ho about societal engineering through architecture. What was interesting to me was that sort of suddenly the literature turned away from talking about societal engineering when there was this kind of people's docket of the state receding from kind of major grandiose projects, and we start talking about neoliberalism and globalization and so on, and so people are talking about all these organic things that are happening, but the expert kind of just sits there, right? We know very little about what they're doing now, and so what part of this project was doing is recuperate that, like, where is the expert today? And societal engineering is alive and well, even with the most kind of what I call self-reflexive of experts sees architecture. There's almost like a hope in it, right? There's something about the built environment, its interaction with how people live in it that they see as performative in particular ways. And that carries a lot of contradictions, right? The kind of contradictions that we saw with modernizing projects, again, we see today, but for very different political projects. So chapter 4 has this whole section on, so it's really interesting because Aga Khan, the Aga Khan team itself is super divided on what community means, whether or not people are collaborative to begin with, how much architecture can matter, how much this is about Darb al-Ahmar or all Egyptians or everyone in the world. And so there's a lot of debate, and from it then arise, what ultimately the team ends up doing, but also particular experts. It kind of depends on, when you see this a lot in the EU project as well, it kind of depends on who knocks on your door that day when you're drawing the plans. The extent to which they'll allow you to have the balcony look a particular way, or your bathroom to stay or to go. So there's a really interesting kind of, right, it's not as unitary as we think of it, right? And so that produces, but it produces the kinds of contradictions that come with, right? Like producing a world in which you have less control over your water, when you could have more, right? It's interesting to think about it in terms of water insecurity. I hadn't done that before, but I like that, sort of bringing that in, especially because a lot of what the Aga Khan was doing was very environmentally conscious. So for example, they install a lot of solar panels. They produced rooftops for buildings that did not previously have them, and then installed solar panels in a really interesting project that then kind of completely fell apart. So yeah, but just to say, these kinds of contradictions are alive and well, but they will look different in a world in which these projects are not necessarily orchestrated by the state at a particular kind of level, right? And in which different individuals have different kind of power than they used to. So that's something to keep in mind. Yeah, that's the Cairo Today question. I've been thinking about that quite a bit, and that was kind of why the book ends with a reflection on populism, because what you see today is pretty much this, the kind of power that Sisi believes he has. To so kind of unilaterally transform the city comes from a belief and a very kind of strong populist support for the regime. And I argue that, we're not actually living in a world of pendulums where, we go from, a particular different kinds of politics, like a neoliberalism that doesn't look anything like a populism, right? And instead, what I argue is, you can see the birth of all of that sort of politics from within how neoliberalism operates. And so a lot of people have written books about how we are in the post-neoliberal moment. There's no way to understand that kind of destruction except to say that we are in a post-neoliberal moment. So please stop talking about neoliberalism. I get that a lot. Please stop talking about neoliberalism. And my argument is that, we'll never, yes, the moment we are in today looks pretty different from where we were 10 years ago, but we can't understand where we got here and how to get out of it without understanding, what happened 10 years ago. And so a lot of the festering politics that I'm talking about, we see quite a bit of, where is it going with this? Well, anyway, a lot of suspicion, a lot of conspiracy theories, and that gets back to Fida's question, right? Did the people of Darb al-Ahmar know what was happening? What were the experts thinking? For a lot of them, they did not, and they saw some things that they really couldn't comprehend. Like, why is this family's home getting restored and not mine? When you ask the expert, they have a really good about community, and people just didn't negotiate well in this building, and in this building they were really cooperative, so we gave them the money. And people are but instead people have all these arguments about how the Aga Khan here is just to kind of here to steal a lot of treasures from the neighborhood. That was a really interesting rumor that I heard quite a bit. And all sorts of things that the Aga Khan, I mean, I would just I'm sitting here assuming that they are not doing, right, and are pretty much conspiracy theories, but that are grounded in a particular understanding of this project and how it kind of people came to see it. And then, we build on that, conspiracy, and so on is a lot of the work that goes into the building of populist politics, right? So it's pretty important to see the connections between these things if we're going to try to move past it, hopefully. There's a lot of other
I'm gonna cut you off so that we can get Dima's voice before we have to wrap up.
Yeah, okay, so really quickly, in terms of alternative, like sustainability of alternative politics, I think, after the uprising in 2019, there were agricultural projects between different regions where certain, depending on the environment, people would grow different things and then they would trade with each other. So like the Air and the Bekaa Valley and the, Tripoli or the South. This was a project that was pretty efficient, but with the economic collapse, traveling is really difficult. The cost of getting from, even places that aren't that far has quadrupled. But I think, we see projects or sort of sustainable politics amongst, queer communities in Lebanon, the feminist communities in Lebanon, migrant communities. There's Enya Lenya is this Ethiopian migrant community that's organizing in Lebanon, and that's where you sort of see real, let me not use the word real, but like sort of sustained politics emerging. And I think, but in order for that to happen, it sort of necessitates already being like an outcast. You already have to not have rights in order to be able to organize, and the state doesn't care really because they don't care about you. But yeah. And then in terms of the question of scale, yeah, I think about this a lot in my work. And I think I'm more skeptical, and I think this also goes back to what you asked. I think that there are people who do work in like the Beirut Urban Lab or people who are with Beirut Medinati who believe that, there's still hope for municipalities. And I don't feel that way at all. I think that so long as the laws are in place that only allow people to participate in municipal politics based on their, if they are registered, and you cannot just come and register where you live, right? This is like the 1932 census is what it goes back to. So I don't think there's any hope. And I also think that, the notion that scale or smaller scales or local scales is productive is actually what ends up sort of damaging potentials for change in these contexts, because it keeps people tied into the sort of system that has created the conditions that we're living in, right? And then I said the part about Beirut Medinati. Yeah, and I think that unless the sort of laws change, or unless we all sort of become ungovernable and like, sort of outcasts in this, there's not much that relying on local politics or municipalities can do, in my opinion. I've been told that isn't like, it's not nice because people are really trying to do that work. Yeah, but I feel a lot more skeptical of that. But people like Mona Fawaz, Mona Harb, Sami Abdullah, they do amazing work on decentralization and its potential. And I love their work, but I'm on the other side of that.
Very good. So much great food for thought from both of you. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful event. Thank you to our discussants.